Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. We're discussing the situation, of course, in Ukraine, part of our continuing coverage of the situation. Talks began on the Belarus border between representatives of Ukraine and Russia, but the one voice, of course, that counts in this whole affair, the one voice that could actually end it all with just one word, is that of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. Has he already gone too far? Some saying perhaps he has. Has he perhaps signed the end of his own time in power? With almost the whole world united against his aggression against Ukraine, we are asking, will the talks, will the sanctions be enough to stop Putin? Sanctions, of course, levelled against him personally and other prominent Russians like Sergei Lavrov, oligarchs in Russia and beyond, all linked to Putin, are asking questions about how this will affect them. And of course, on the ground, more and more support for Ukraine against this Russian invasion. Let's introduce you to our panel to debate this. Joining us by Skype from Warsaw, we have Maria Zalkina, political analyst at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Maria, thank you very much for being with us. I understand from the last time we spoke, you are from Kiev, but actually joining us from Warsaw, so your insight in this one is essential. Joining us by satellite from Washington, D.C., Melinda Herring, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Melinda, thanks very much for being with us. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this situation, as ever. By Skype from Hamburg, Ulrich Kuhn, who's from the Institute for Peace, Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Ulrich, thank you for being with us. And here in the studio, Julien Théron, who is a political scientist at Sciences Po here in Paris and author of the book, and the title in French is Poutine, la stratégie du désordre, which translates as Putin, the strategy of disorder. Thank you for being with us. Before we let loose the panel to discuss the issues relating to what's happening in Ukraine right now, let's take a look at this from our reporter who is there, Gulliver Cragg.
Ivan and Serhiy never thought the war could come right to their village. But on Sunday morning, Ukrainian air defences shot down an incoming rocket, scattering debris and damaging their houses.
So that's the situation. We'd been working for years on that house, my family and my wife's family. We were planning to move in this year. You could see it's now got no roof, no windows and no doors. We won't be able to move in so soon. That's part of the debris. The rocket was aimed at somewhere else, but landed here when our forces shot it.
The air defense system worked, and they shot it down. Good that it didn't reach its target. They're not aiming at poor villagers. They want to hit our defense forces.
Nearby, galvanized by these events, villagers have set up a checkpoint and are working on a dugout.
We're going to fight the Russians and defend ourselves any way possible.
We'll fight them, of course. We're not going to let them stay and give them food.
Checkpoints like this are springing up all over the district, all over the country, in fact. The work of volunteers. Local kids are also involved.
There were more people here before, but they left because there wasn't much work.
Did you hear Putin say today he wants to prepare the nuclear weapons?
Don't worry, we'll shoot those missiles down with catapults.
Joking aside, this spirit of determination to do everything possible to fight off the Russians is to be found all over Ukraine.
Gulliver Cragg there, finding the indomitable spirits of some Ukrainian people in the face of the onslaught that is coming towards them. It has to be said, though, that the Russians perhaps not expecting the kind of resistance that they have met. Let's bring in first to comment on this Maria Zalkina, who's in Warsaw, from Kiev originally. Maria, you told me last time, political analyst at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thanks for being with us. I'm wondering what your thoughts are right now. We've had the talks on the Belarus border. We're hearing about, obviously, resistance building up within Ukraine against the Russians and people willing to basically give their lives to stop what's going on. What are your thoughts about the situation right now and where it goes?
Thank you. Yes, I'm from Kiev actually, but I was grown up in the very east of Ukraine, in Stanitsa Luganskaya. It was the checkpoint between occupied Donbas and government by Ukrainian side Donbas. So the my personal geography, let's say, of the conflict is really touching me, then touching my heart, because as of now, for instance, Stanitsa Luganskaya, my native actually town, was captured by occupational forces, but we hope it will be brought back by Ukrainian army in coming days. So when it comes to Kiev, really Russian army didn't expect, and Russian political establishment really didn't expect that kind of resistance, because in Kiev, this is around already almost 50,000 of people in so-called territorial defense forces, which are armed, which have needed equipment. The only thing they don't have is like some kind of tanks, machines, and that kind of artillery weapons. But they have automatic guns, and they have, most of them are reservists. It means that they have some kind of military experience in their past. So that is why in Kiev during last 2 days, the level of threat of Russian invasion exactly into Kiev was very high, but they didn't succeed from any direction they tried to do it. And unfortunately for us, Kiev is still a symbol for Russia. It is obvious that they are trying to encircle fully the city, to block it, and to blackmail then Ukrainians. As of now, in Kiev, in evening, the missile strikes already started. The satellite town Brovary, which is like 10 kilometers from Kiev border, I was actually living in that satellite town, so I know how it looks on the ground very well. This town was the object for airstrike attack like 30 minutes ago. At least six people are injured. So Russians are trying to capture the Kiev from all the possible directions, but all their attempts so far were not successful. And from Belarus, they have trying to add new forces. They added some new tanks columns right into Kiev. They stopped a couple of dozens kilometers from Kiev, and of course they will try to attack. But according to Ukrainian officials, to the Ministry of Defense, this day, exactly this one and maybe the next one, they're actually decisive for the situation in case Russians will not succeed neither with Kiev nor with Kharkiv, which are like two largest cities among all those around which the battles are going on. Then Russia will be actually in need to change their tactics dramatically. And here we have, on the one hand, more positive possible scenario when they will maybe try to negotiate somehow, but to a high extent, the worst possible scenario is possible because they are trying to hit residential areas, create chaos, kill as much people as they can with airstrikes and missile attacks, and destroy Ukrainian cities at all. And also the threat of using nuclear power, either from Russian territory or by missile attack on Ukrainian nuclear power plants, is also very high because on the land, Russians are not as successful as they wanted to be.
Maria, I think you've summed it up for us there. Let me just add to that, 352 people, civilians, that's the civilian death toll according to Ukraine's health ministry right now, which I think brings home just that people are dying in this conflict. It's not just about an army coming in and taking over some land. People are getting killed. Maria, thank you very much indeed. Belinda Herring there in Washington, listening to what Maria was saying there to kick off this discussion. What will Vladimir Putin be thinking right now, do you think?
That's a great question, and I think everyone wants to know that. So Vladimir Putin, the Vladimir Putin we've known and studied since the end of 1999, is not the same man today. He's acting in strange ways. He's taking greater risks than he's taken in the past. We've heard story after story of him in negotiations where he doesn't want to talk about the Minsk agreements or off-ramps, diplomatic off-ramps to the conflict. He wants to talk about Russia's historic grievances. He wants to talk about what NATO has done to him. So he's very angry, and he's behaving in a different way. He's, of course, threatened nuclear war, and no one knows, is he serious about it? It looks like from the pictures that his immediate team is very uncomfortable with this. But will they go along with it? I wish I could tell you something more. It's anyone's guess. Putin is isolated. He's been very, very isolated during COVID. And a lot of people think he may be sick or immunocompromised because he's requiring anyone who sees him to go into quarantine or to take 3 PCR tests, as he demanded of Emmanuel Macron. I think, though, I want to say something in response to what Maria said. She's right that the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian volunteers are heroic and brave, and they're doing an amazing job. But we need to be frank. There's a moment of optimism right now. Europe has unified behind Ukraine, and that's fabulous. We're seeing things happen that I really never expected, right? The Finns have just said that they're going to send weapons. Finland and Sweden are probably going to join NATO relatively soon. This is very, very good. But we need to be analytically honest. The Russians have held back so far, and they're not going to continue to hold back. This war is going to get much, much worse, and there's going to be massive civilian casualties. And there's probably going to be 5 to 7 million Ukrainian refugees pouring into the European Union if the situation continues at the pace that it's going at now.
Indeed, already 500,000 have made the crossing over. One woman I spoke to who was in the Kiev metro last Thursday, now safe in Romania, described getting through the borders as, well, difficult to say the very least. Melinda, for now, thank you very much indeed. Julien Theron, can I bring you in to talk about, with your kind of knowledge of Putin, picking up from what Melinda was saying. His situation here, is he in a kind of an impasse where he can't go any further? Has he gone too far? Or does he have a completely different take on this whole thing? What's your kind of reaction? What's your thought?
When we conceptualized this strategy of disorder with Isabelle Mandreau, my co-author of the book, we understood that it was a broad strategy against the West because the Kremlin considered itself at war with the West. Something that is very hard for us to understand, first because it's not at all our war polity, and because we have no confliction whatsoever against Russia, right? But they do consider themselves at war. I'm not talking about the Russians, I'm talking about the Kremlin itself. And in this respect, we have to understand the psyche of the people in the Kremlin, especially talking about what we call the Siloviki, the persons who are responsible for the force, mainly intelligence services and the army. And in this respect, we were completely right to say that there is a discomfort about what is doing Vladimir Putin today, because yes, it does correspond to strategy of disorder. We can say so it's the continuation of what was happening in Georgia, in Syria. Syria, pretty much indeed, complete chaos over there, protecting a dictator able to gas his own people, use massive torture and so on. So yes, we could say that. But in the same time, I see at least 2 elements that are really questioning about, I wouldn't say is, psyche or something like that, because I'm not, a psychologist, so I don't want to express myself on that. But still, the first one is the fact that when it's self-justified with the war on Ukraine, he used such a speech and so outrageous reasons with the genocide, the Nazis, now the drug addicts. I mean, that nobody can, with quite reasonable experience of what is happening in Ukraine, can even believe in it, right? So that's a first. That's a first. The second element is he didn't even try to bring types of proofs or even the beginning of it, and that's quite new as well. I mean, he just went to war with 1-hour speech, outrageous speech, without any kind of proof. And that's new. That's brand new. We can say that this whole adventure. I was in Kiev last month, actually, to understand precisely through my research how they conceptualize the whole resistance warfare, because they had this national resistance law at the beginning of January, and the colleagues were completely right. Now we have the territorial defense battalion, we have a bit of national guards, meaning like more or less a gendarmerie or something like that, plus the army and so on, and even a lot of initiatives from the civil society itself, from military side, but even conceptually warfare and so on. And it's like in Moscow they didn't see that, and it seems obvious. And this is why a lot of people actually mistaken themselves, because they thought that there would be no war. But it seemed obvious that it was going to be hell for Russian forces. But I definitely agree it will be much worse in the coming days. Syria has been created and protected to create a precedent for the whole century, to make us used to an extreme type of violence, besiege cities with civilians inside, bombing hospitals, schools, markets is fine, bombing the ICRC even is fine, using gas is fine. So I definitely agree they are still holding themselves, and Vladimir Putin is saying usually things. He said that he will denazify the country, meaning that he wants to get rid of anything which is not aligned on Russia in the country. Second, he said, I will broaden the attack over there. He's saying what he's doing actually. And this means way worse. And if you understand the position he's in, like we said, the first cycle does not quite understand. Is a little bit like under attack even from the inside, the population, and potentially even the oligarchs and the Siloviki. So it is just like on a row, is just like going to go further, I think.
Julian, thank you very much indeed. Ulrich Kuhn, I know you're listening and clearly have things that you want to say too, from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy there at the University of Hamburg. Parallels are being drawn, and perhaps they're a bit, it's a bit of a reach, but parallels are being drawn between what Putin's doing and what Adolf Hitler tried to do, in terms of taking back land, in terms of using excuses to move into countries, those kind of things. Now, perhaps it's a bit of a reach, but what is your sense about the possibility of stopping this? I mean, do you hear anything that's given you a sense that this can be stopped?
Well, first of all, I do get drawing these parallels, because what we see Mr. Putin is doing here really recalls the darkest periods of the 20th century. His talking about race, his talking about not accepting that there is a Ukrainian statehood, that there is a Ukrainian folk, the whole idea about conquering land in land warfare, that very much recalls what we heard or what we've seen in history from the Nazis. So I do get these parallels. The question, how do we get out of this whole quagmire? This is really something that concerns me since the last, let's say, 48 hours, particularly now that we see that the Russian campaign is not going as Putin expected it to be. And honestly, this is very much because of the brave fight of the Ukrainians. But I think it's also because what we see is, don't get me wrong, probably not a very professional campaign on the side of the Russians. So the point that I want to make here is, what would be a good outcome here? I mean, I think most analysts expected that the Russians would be able to invade Ukraine within a couple of days or weeks. And of course, we've seen from history that those kind of aggressive leaders, the appetite comes with the eating. So if Putin is still able to achieve an early victory here, then the question would be, would he stop here, or would the next be perhaps Moldova, or perhaps even the Baltic states that are protected by Article 5 NATO commitments? The other side is, if Putin is not able to make a quick win, if this becomes a protracted conflict that goes on and costs more and more Russian soldiers' lives, will he have to back down? I don't see Putin backing down. I think then the risk really increases, and we heard that at the beginning, that perhaps Putin might ponder even employing nuclear weapons. So the question here is really, what are the potential off-ramps? And I know it might sound at this point not really morally right to think about off-ramps for a war criminal, but I think if we want to make sure that this whole thing does not become bigger than it already is right now, we really in the West need to think, what are those potential off-ramps?
Indeed, and that tag of war criminal indeed is something that has been very much associated with Vladimir Putin because of this whole campaign that he's put into Ukraine. I'm wondering, you raised the issue there about nuclear attack, Ulrich. Surely that would be madness, would it not? Because there's no such thing as a safe, contained, well-tailored nuclear attack, is there?
Well, let's just recall what the Russians put out a couple of weeks ago together with the United States, with France, with the UK, and with China. They basically echoed a statement from Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev from 1987, that is, a nuclear war cannot be won, so it should never be fought. That's something that they put in writing at the beginning of this year. So I would like to remind the Russian president that his country signed up to that. And I think that's exactly what Western leaders need to do right now. Remind the Russians that they do have a global responsibility here. And in that regard, I have to say that the reactions by Stratcom, by the US leaders, also in France, in the UK, that was exactly how you respond to these kind of threats. They basically said, look, don't do it. There's no reason to do it. We will not mirror what you're doing. Just stay calm. We know you're nuclear armed. You know we're nuclear armed. So let's just not get into that.
The nuclear deterrent is the phrase that comes back to me from my history teacher when I was a lad. Ulrich, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a look then at the nuclear arsenal, what could be at the disposal of Vladimir Putin should he choose. And he's hinted that he will, and we're hearing today that all aspects of Russia's nuclear arsenal is on standby. Emerald Maxwell with this.
Vladimir Putin raised the stakes when he ordered Russia's deterrence forces, which wield nuclear weapons, onto high alert. An alarming move, given that Moscow has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, last year Russia had over 6,000 warheads, slightly more than its American rival. Of these, Russia has more than 1,600 warheads deployed, meaning they're on missiles or bomber bases ready to be fired at relatively short notice. Between them, Russia and the US possess approximately 90% of the world's stockpile. In among the Russian arsenal is a weapon known by its NATO codename Satan II. The RS-28 Sarmat is the largest intercontinental ballistic missile ever made. Russian authorities claim its range exceeds 10,000 kilometers and it's capable of carrying between 10 and 15 nuclear warheads, meaning it could destroy a territory the size of France. The West fears that a constitutional shift from Russia's ally Belarus to allow nuclear missiles on its soil could now bring Moscow's devastating weapons closer to their borders.
We know what does it mean for Belarus to be nuclear. It means that Russia will put nuclear weapons in Belarus. And this is a very dangerous path.
Like other nuclear weapon states, Moscow has used its capability primarily as a deterrent. And this isn't the first time Putin has made such threats. Russian nuclear forces were also put on high alert during the 2014 annexation of Crimea to put off any retaliation.
It is very sobering watching that report. Julien, your quick reaction?
Yes, I think we did a mistake before this third invasion of Ukraine, because let's remember that it was the third one. A mistake of perception that we didn't see it coming in Western Europe, because we didn't want to listen to the Baltic states. We spoke about American alarmism and these sort of things. Now, like our guest said it, we are in a moment of triumphalism, because Europe united, changed its path, Germany invested a massive amount of money, we transfer weapons, even planes, that's brand new, we are uniting Europe and NATO. That would be a mistake, to think that now we are in a phase of triumphalism. We should not, because the crisis is continuing. It might be continuing, like we said earlier, in terms of conventional warfare, getting worse against the civilians as well. But it might be nuclear as well. Let me say just a couple of things. When we think, like you said, Mark, when we think about nuclear, we think about Saturn II, big missiles, strategic bombers, strategic submarines, and so on. It's not only that. It might be the case, and we shall not think that this would never happen. But there's also other things as nuclear. Actually, nuclear went tactical these last decades. We have lower enriched ammunition, and we have also what we call mini nukes, for instance, against bunkers, against facilities buried into a mountain. And we can use like operational nuclear against, for instance, a communication center or a heavily guarded base or something like that. So, I mean, we have several layers. And I worked a bit on this possibility to actually that we are wrong about nuclear being just about deterrence. You don't touch me, you don't touch, it's this mutual assured destruction doctrine. But we are way past that. And actually nuclear can be, in practice on the theatre of war, actually.
Indeed. I wonder what our viewers in Ukraine might be feeling right now, hearing this very chilling explanation about what could happen. Let's go back to Warsaw. Poland, where Maria Zolkina is awaiting us, political analyst at Iko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation, originally from Donbass, brought up in Kiev, now living in Warsaw. Maria, I'm asking you to speak for the whole country of Ukraine. How do you think people are feeling right now, hearing this?
People are really scared with the probability of usage of nuclear weapon by Russia. The fact is that after invasion of Russia and after this absolutely cruel airstrikes and missile attacks on people, on ordinary people, on civilians, the general perception of the situation among locals is that Putin is a mad guy. And as far as we see, up to this moment, he is of course not ready to give up with his invasion into Ukraine, and it seems that he can be, let's say, cornered to some extent. If he is not succeeding with his original plan of Blitzkrieg, he is not. We understand that he is not succeeding. He hasn't succeeded with that. Up to this moment. So he has to increase the level of casualties against civilians. He has to destroy our cities. And another idea is to create ecological catastrophe, or to use cruel instruments in terms of using nuclear weapons. I will remind to our audience that yesterday Russia has already organized missile attack on the settlement near Kiev, where the radioactive waste disposal site is. And it was just fortune that missiles just landed very close to the to this site, to this disposal, but not inside the storage actually of radioactive elements themselves. So people really are scared with the possibility of using this kind of mad instrument against Ukraine, and that is why these days the most let's say popular demand towards our partners on the side of Ukrainian people is to make at least to try to make the sky safe. Of course, it will not help in case Russia will use nuclear weapons against Ukraine and the whole Europe, but at least it will help to prevent all those cruel airstrikes and missile attacks against civilians in residential areas. And that is why so people are talking mainly only about it, not about other sanctions, but about the idea to create urgently safe zone, non-fly zone above Ukraine. And this is not a military mean like Western countries as of now think, and as they explain to us that this is the argument, it will be military confrontation between NATO and Russia, and everyone in NATO still wants to prevent this kind of confrontation. But it is also can be considered as a humanitarian mean, as a humanitarian idea to prevent these cruel developments in Ukraine.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. Just reminding people, Ukraine's health ministry says 352 people, civilians, have been killed. Among those, sadly, 14 children. As Maria was speaking to us, we saw images that our team in Ukraine has filmed of basically women, children, you've got babes in arms, sheltering from what might happen. We're hearing here on set that there could be a kind of low-grade nuclear usage of weaponry which could target any kind of place that the Russians want to strike. The resistance continues with the civilians standing up in Ukraine and slowing down that Russian advance. Melinda Herring from the Atlantic Council, I'd like to bring you back in. Eurasia specialist, of course, as I think is apparent from everything you say. Vladimir Putin, madman or Machiavel? What do you think? Is it a mix of both, perhaps?
I think both, Mark. Do you mind if I pull us back from the nuclear
Please,
abyss for
go
just
ahead,
a minute
go ahead.
and offer a tiny bit of hope?
Please, go on.
Okay, great. I thought this... I'm usually the skunk at the garden party, but I can't do that today. You guys have outpaced me. So I want to make an argument. I'm a think tank expert. I'm not an Old Testament prophet, so I'm not going to give you a date. But I think it's pretty clear that Putin is done, and he's severely miscalculated. So Vladimir Putin thinks he understands Ukraine better than he actually does. He thought that he could go into Ukraine, and it would be only a matter of days and hours for Kiev and the country to roll over. And he's finding a fierce resistance, as Maria has said. Not only is the Ukrainian army much stronger than he expected, we've seen thousands of ordinary peoples, lawyers, accountants, doctors, who are now running around the country with AK-47s. Do they have the same kind of training as Russian military? No, they don't. Some of them do have a military background. Is it enough? No. Russia has a much better Air Force and a much better Navy. But with, they're much more determined than the Russian forces are. They know that this struggle is existential. They've been fighting this war for 8 years, and it's also their home turf. So they do have a number of advantages. But I think we also have to look at what's going on in Russia itself. So in the last week, there were protests across Russia. Are they massive and going to shake Putin to the ground now? No. But there were protests in 53 different cities. We're seeing Russian oligarchs coming out and condemning Vladimir Putin. We know that more and more people don't want to support the war effort. And Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, gave an incredibly powerful address. He spoke in Russian to the Russian people, and he said, Ukraine is not what you think it is. We don't want war. We want peace. And he called on all Russian citizens to resist. I had chills up my spine. I think it was very, very powerful. So, look, I can't tell you when it's going to happen, but Putin's legitimacy is eroding before our eyes.
Indeed, those protests that we've seen, Melinda, in Moscow around Russia against this, I'll say unprecedented. It's an overused word these days, but it is something you don't see very often in Russia, that kind of open dissent in the streets.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's important to remind your viewers, too, that Russia has changed a lot since 2014. So in 2014, Putin came into Ukraine and he annexed the Crimea Peninsula. It was illegal. And then he tried to take part of the Donbass. And he's been occupying about 7% of the Donbass for 8 years. When that happened in 2014, there were massive protests in Moscow. Russians didn't like it, but Russia has changed a lot since 2014. It's become increasingly repressive. Almost all the opposition has moved abroad. Independent media has been suppressed. Civil society has been suppressed. So it's really hard to get people to come out on the streets because they're afraid of being put in jail and they're afraid for their physical security. So the fact that we're seeing protests across Russia is extraordinary.
Indeed, Russian propaganda units RT, Sputnik being banned in the EU. The similar bans in the UK. Russia's likely to ban the BBC. France 24, we understand, still available everywhere. So we'll continue to give the truth and tell the story straight down the middle with no bias. But, we can only reflect what we see, what we hear, what we know, and what our correspondents find. And this is what we're trying to do here, and bring in some expert analysis too. Ulrich in Hamburg from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, Ulrich Kuhn. Germany's position's changed, that of Finland to that of Sweden. Putin perhaps succeeding in uniting his enemies all against him.
Yeah. That's certainly one of the inadvertent outcomes, I would say, at least from the perspective of Mr. Putin. I think no one was expecting the European Union to rally around the flag that fast. I think no one was expecting that Germany would really see that as a watershed moment, that Germany would actually give up on its policy of economics first, but now actually turns to a security first policy. And particularly when we also look at the other states that are not a part of either NATO or the European Union, even skeptical countries like Switzerland and Austria are coming on board. So I think that's he has succeeded to build a front. The question is, what do we do with that now? And the question is, what happens in Russia? I have to say, I'm not as optimistic as Melinda is as regards the Russians rising up against Mr. Putin. I hope they would, but from what I hear from Moscow, this seems not to be really the case. And I mean, I personally could imagine at some point that we might see a palace coup where some of Putin's inner clique, particularly perhaps from the armed forces, actually decide that it's enough with that leader. But let's be careful what we're wishing for, because this is Russia. We have no idea what comes after Putin. We think that's the worst outcome. Well, let's not be naive. We don't know whether the next leader in Russia will be the democratic president of our liking.
Indeed. Ulrich, thank you very much indeed. It was Julian earlier who mentioned Georgia 2008, of course, when Putin found an excuse to go in and support two Georgian enclaves who'd apparently asked for his support. Let's hear now from the president of Georgia, who's in Paris. She was speaking earlier.
I think that he is becoming aware that he has given birth to a monster. He has created a Europe more powerful than has ever existed before. Everything he feared, that is to say to have states that are unified and strong militarily at his border, he is going to get that.
Salamir Zurabashvili there, the president of Georgia. Julian Theron, this is possibly the final comment, but we'll try to get everybody in if I possibly can. Has a monster been created? Can the monster be stopped? What happens next?
I think that the war in Ukraine cannot be won by the Russians. We have no, in war studies, we have no example of a conventional army staying on the long run on a territory, especially on a territory on 44 million inhabitants, where, yes, a lot of them left, but not that much regarding 44 million, right? They cannot. They just cannot. And indeed, I think that Vladimir Putin is reading not that well Ukraine, and I think he might be reading not that well Russia neither. It's a war also inside Russia, although it's not a conventional military over there. It's political, but it matters a lot indeed. So the problem there, and I do agree with Ulrich that he has to find a way out. If he doesn't find a way out, he will go further and further and further until, keeping the power, whatever danger he creates for us, all the Europeans and the Russians as well. So we are in a strategic situation which is really tensed, and obviously the main power rests actually in the hands of the Russians themselves. But yes, Melinda said it. Yeah, well, actually, they live in a very repressed society more than in 2014, indeed. So it's quite difficult to say if they managed to, create a new democratic society in Russia, right? Or if perhaps, because that's a possibility, that a new leader in Russia, post-Vladimir Putin, hyper-centralized power might be actually even worse.
My producer, Alessandro, has stolen more time for us so I can get everybody in before we end the show. Let's go to Maria back in Warsaw. Maria, the what happens next question is what I'm putting to you. And we heard, obviously, that we don't know quite what follows Vladimir Putin. Ulrich was talking about that, I think. From your perspective, from where you're looking at this thing in Warsaw, what is the worst case scenario? If he is taken away, if he is pushed aside, what do you think will happen next?
The worst possible scenario is that he really attacks some critical enterprises, including nuclear power plant. I remind that in Zaporizhia, which is very close to the active battlefield, and Zaporizhia itself was already hit by missiles, but not as heavily as other cities of Ukraine. In Zaporizhia, the biggest nuclear power station in Europe is situated. Besides of that, Russians have occupied and controlled the Chernobyl zone, and according to radiologists, the level of radiation is already increasing right there. So as of now, this is the worst possible scenario, which will be supported by the hostilities and casualties against ordinary people in residential areas all over Ukraine. That's why Ukraine needs as much weapons as it possible, including air defense system. The maximum which Ukraine, full isolation of Russia in terms of financial connections and all other means of isolation. And Ukraine's maximum goal for these coming days is to stand firm, to keep all the cities controlled by Ukrainian government, and to continue to demand NATO countries to support Ukraine either with the most serious possible air defense system or maximum with non-fly zone above Ukraine.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. Ulrich, can I bring you back in? Ulrich from the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy. That idea of more arms, is that the solution? Obviously, the EU's decided on this unprecedented, and there's that word again, 450 million euro military aid, which is going to be given to help Ukraine. Is that the right thing?
Well, I think in the end, for the next couple of days and weeks, the West needs to walk an extremely fine line between supporting the Ukrainian army, also with weapons, and at the same time making sure that the West does not end up in an inadvertent escalation scenario with Russia, between Russia and NATO. In that regard, I'm against the establishment of a no-fly zone because technically it would mean to take out Russian forces via NATO forces, and I think that's exactly the kind of scenario that we need to avoid in the end.
Ulrich, thank you very much indeed. Final comment will go to Melinda Haring, Eurasia specialist at the Atlantic Council. And I'm wondering, Melinda, and obviously take this wherever you want and say whatever you wish, but what does Joe Biden do when he hears all these things about the nuclear threat?
I think Joe Biden knows that we can't blink right now, and Zelensky knows that we can't blink right now. One thing that we haven't talked about during this debate is the massive change in President Zelensky. I'm one of his biggest critics. There's a lot of critics in Washington. He was not a good president for the first 2 years. He backtracked on almost all of the important anti-corruption and judicial reform, but he's become a world-class leader in the last 5 days. He's shown a stiff upper lip. He's inspired the world. When reports came out that the U.S. had offered him a lift out of Kiev, he said, "I don't need a lift, I need ammo." He is walking around. He's not hiding in a bunker. He's communicating with people. And I think that we have seen the birth of a great leader who is inspiring the West and reminding us why the West was great and that we have to fight for freedom every single day. So that I'm keeping my eye on Zelensky, and we know that the Russians want to assassinate him, and that would be a big loss. But Ukraine will still survive without Zelensky, and I think the battle for Kiev is going to be pivotal. We know that there's U.S. intel assessments that say that Kiev will fall in a couple of days. We don't know. We don't know what Vladimir Putin is thinking. We don't know what his general staff is thinking. Let's hope and pray that they can talk some sense into him.
Melinda, thank you very much indeed. Melinda Haring there from the Atlantic Council. Thanks to Ulrich Kohn from the University of Hamburg. Thanks to Maria Ozlakina of the Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. And thanks to my guest here in studio, Julien Daron of Sciences Po, author of La Stratégie du Désordre. Putin, La Stratégie du Désordre. Thank you so very much indeed. And thanks to you for watching too. Stay with us here for more coverage on the Ukraine crisis here on France 24.